opening with a prayer, this time from the Psalter. Blessed is the person who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of scoffers, but their delight is in the law of the Lord, and on God's law he or she meditates day and night. He or she is like a tree planted by streams of water that yields its fruit in its season, and its leaf does not wither. In all that he or she does, they prosper. Amen. So, Dr. Waters had planned to join us at the beginning of class today for a significant period of time with the intention of introducing part of the paradigmatic essay for what turns out to hinge on the majority of the rest of the classes. For reasons that are due to technological advances and disruptions therein, he has been unable to join us. He is somewhere between Cambridge and London and had hoped to be at London, at Heathrow, able to join us at the airport while he waited a flight to Edinburgh. But that is not the case. So we are going with what was originally planned A for this part of the lecture. Anyway, tying in both the concept of habituation, virtue, excellence, and the good with the paradigmatic essay. We've just kind of rearranged some things. So last week with healthcare, and this week now, instead of it preceding immediately the start of the paradigmatic essays, we'll pick up economics when Dr. Waters returns. So that's kind of the nuts and bolts of how things are going to proceed today and into the future. The plan is to lecture for maybe a little bit past the first half, and then introduce the paradigmatic essay, answer some questions about it, etc. And then presumably, we will be out of here a little bit early. So we'll kind of play the break by time, depending on how we get through some of this other material, how quickly we move through, and what kinds of questions emerge, etc. So we'll be kind of free, but also obviously constrained by some conventions of breaks, just good manners. So if you can kind of see the overview, the question that we're posing today is, or that I'm posing today, is Yelp or Chopped? Habituation, virtue / excellence, and the good. And so I want to frame the conversation about habituation, virtue, excellence, and the good around sort of what has framed a lot of the conversation in the class, is the modern technoculture. And so both of these things, both television, the television show Chopped, and Yelp as a communication device to for individuals to posit their experience and to describe their experience, good or bad. As you can see, people love us on Yelp, people hate us on Yelp. I've never seen a business post that hate us on Yelp, though. That said, both of those are sort of in our experience or in our culture because of, or as a direct result of, the modern technoculture. We would have historically needed to rely upon the opinions and experiences of our immediate neighbors, people we knew. Now we can go to Yelp and see aggregate numbers of people that are complete strangers, save for a little icon. Television we consume. And we'll see that we then move through sort of with that as a background to ask some foundation questions about Aristotle, philosophy and theology, and then habituation and neuroscience, and then to return to one of the books that you read earlier in the semester, The Remains of the Day, to ask, or to sort of demonstrate how it is that this narrative unfolds the concept of habituation and excellence, virtue, and good. Rather powerfully, I think. So, what is Yelp? So some of you probably have used it. I would guess some of you may be a bit stranger to it. But I want to read a post from Yelp based on a restaurant that is local to Evanston. I was really excited to try this restaurant, really excited. When we came in, the place was half empty, and they told us at the hostess stand that we would have to wait to 15 minutes to order because they'd been flooded with orders. Okay, I thought, it's new, they're a bit unprepared, still room to impress. The atmosphere, nice, trendy, but not really a lot of sunlight up front. But then we ordered. Every question we had seemed to come with a yes, but that will cost more answer, that kind of restaurant. It was brunch, and someone in our party wanted jelly with their toast, and at first they didn't know if they had jelly. Then when they did, it was going to cost $1.50 just to get it, for one piece of toast. Mind you, the butter was delicious. Charging for jelly during brunch? Question. Then the portion were so very small. I was almost embarrassed for them when they brought out my egg white frittata. There were more potatoes on the plate than frittata. It was about 1/10 of a pie of frittata. My husband, who ordered a chicken sandwich, had a great big sandwich with a bunch of fries. Same price. So I guess you have to know what to order before you go there to get the best value for your money. We had a party of 5 and our brunch bill came to $95, a bit pricey for what we had. They are also trying to be earth conscious by not giving everyone at the table a glass of water, which is a little strange, to be honest. At a restaurant? Whatever. And so no salt and peppers at the table. Yes, at a restaurant. Also, make sure you can wait to go to the bathroom if you are elderly, have kids, or disabled. The only ladies' restroom is up a long flight of stairs. I do have to say our waitress was great on one upside of the restaurant. So look, nice thought, but overpriced and measly amount of food. This is a place you would visit just to try out. We won't be back. Fast forward. After my last poor review, the manager invited us to try out again. I have to say we had a quite different experience. This time we had water at our tables and the food was delicious. We came for dinner instead of brunch, so it seemed there were less extras with food, i.e. no jelly, etc. We did not run into trouble with charging for some jelly. We had the cheese curds to start off and they were delicious, especially the sauces that accompanied them. For a meal, I had the catfish gumbo, though it's not really gumbo, and my husband had a burger. We enjoyed both of them. His fries were delicious, as well as his burger. I liked my catfish. I still think it's priced a little too high, but it was very good. For dessert, we had the chocolate peanut butter tart. It might have been one of the best things I've ever tasted. The ice cream with it was rich, creamy, definitely different than anything you can buy in the store. We loved it. Our server was great, very attentive. I also really liked the candlelight in the evening. It was a fun atmosphere and definitely felt like we were in a farmhouse in the evening. I really enjoyed the restaurant this time around. Thank you, blank, though I sort of gave it away, for a great meal. We will be back. The reason I blanked that part out is it's not my intention to either highlight or demean the restaurant, but it's because it's more about Yelp and what it says. In contrast to when we talk about food, the next
4 chefs, 3 courses, only 1 chance to win. Let's do this. The challenge: create an unforgettable meal from the mystery items hidden in these baskets before time runs out. Time's up. Our distinguished panel of chefs will critique their work.
It's completely overdone. What are we supposed to do with these?
And one by one, they must face the dreaded chopping block.
You have been chopped.
Who will win the $10,000 prize? And who will be chopped? Four competitors think they have what it takes to be the chopped champion. Let's meet them. First up, Chef Tommy Lee.
I'm the executive chef here at Battery Gardens here in New York City.
Next, Chef Keith Jobway.
Restaurants and chefing are in my blood.
I grew up cooking in my grandparents' restaurants. I could make a hollandaise sauce better than I can hit a baseball.
And then Chef Bill Feldman.
I cook food for the New York Giant football players, and I'm known as the boxing chef from New York City.
Finally, Chef Lola Garan.
Hi guys, I'm a freelance consultant chef in New York City. If your chef calls in sick or you fire him, then you call me.
There are 3 rounds: appetizer, entree, and dessert. Each course comes with its own basket of mystery ingredients. You must use every ingredient in the basket in some way. Also available to you are pantry and fridge. Each round is timed, and when the clock runs out, the judges will critique your dishes on presentation, taste, and also creativity. If your dish doesn't cut it, you will not move on to the next round. You will be chopped. Chefs, please open the baskets for your appetizer round. And we have chicken breast, kiwi, and zucchini blossoms.
Zucchini blossom is just a dead flower, if you will.
And then what do you do with it?
The clock is set at 20 minutes, and time starts now.
I am trying to stay loose, not let the pressure of the competition get to me. So I've got my nice orange curd glaze there. I just need to add it to the plate. But what I did was, because I'm a numpty, the pan had been in the oven, but I picked it up.
Oh no. Lois just dropped a pan.
Yeah, that was really hot. It was boiling hot, so obviously I dropped it on the floor.
I think Lola burned the hell out of her hands. Her hands shaking.
Lola, did you really burn yourself? Or you
Yeah,
did?
I'm good. I'm good.
You sure?
Yep, absolutely.
Let us know, because we'll take care of it.
The glaze is all over the floor. There's no time left. And it's a disaster.
1 minute, chefs.
I don't think we're going to be getting any food. Fine, fine.
It was like 45 seconds. I think I grabbed plates.
Keith is giving us a photo finish here. 10, 9, 8.
Everything is zoned out to me. I'm just focused on getting this thing done.
4, 3, 2, 1. Time's up. Please step away.
Woo! How fun was that?
Who won?
You know, I don't know who won that round. It's just a clip. So those of you who know the show know what happens next. The 4 chefs who are on the chopping block go out of the room. Their dishes are presented. They taste. The 3 panel of judges who are all experts in the culinary world discuss the appearance, taste, and presentation of the dish. They confer and consensus decide who is not going to make it out of that round. The next contestants then move, or the contestants that remain then move to the next round where they prepare an entree, and then after that, dessert, and where one is left. So, what is the difference between Yelp and Chopped? What are some of the differences that you see just sort of?
Well, the reviews of the food for Yelp come from everyday folks and not necessarily people who have a culinary background or expertise about how something should look or taste versus in Chopped. That panel of judges are from the culinary world, so their critique is probably a little different than us folks would be.
Well, in Chop, the critique is directly to the person, and it's more like a roundabout way to critique someone.
Sure.
There's I think there's a kind of power dynamic that's present in Chop that's much more brash and direct than one thing that some of my friends and I comment on, that with something like Yelp, the reviews either tend to be really, really good or really, really bad, and there's not a lot of middle grounds, whereas I think with Chopped, even though it's very direct, there's also a balance there.
Right. Now, consider the different environments partially, right? When it's television, you're not going to, right? Like, television thrives off conflict and in your face, like, right? Like, just, it was undercut.
One's meant to be entertaining, whereas the other is meant to be informative. And
potentially, right? Like, you definitely have the opportunity at the bottom of Yelp pages to say, like, this was funny, this was cool, this, you know, this is helpful, it was not. So, and there is, like, if you look at reviews of places, there is definitely now a whole subculture, I'll be right with you, that it writes reviews in order to be funny and to see if the reviews can go viral. So, coming back to there.
Chopped, you only get one option. You try your review, you're done, you're out. Yelp,
Sure.
you go in, people come,
Well, you can't go back.
You come back and you revise it and give them a better one than the time before, whereas Chopped, you're Chopped.
Potentially, sure, sure.
Yelp, you also have that sense of anonymity, at least at the beginning, where you can go to the restaurant and have a bad time, and they won't necessarily know it until they get that review, and like in the case that you provided, they'll reach out, and then at that point, the anonymity is potentially broken.
Sure.
And so that kind of can. amplify the response that you had because you're using it as a sounding off platform.
Sure. Right. So I think there are some key differences that we've begun to notice, but underlying both, right? It's still sort of around the rituals of food, the practices of food, or food in general. And so, what I want us to do now is kind of hold those two thoughts and hold those two ideas in our collective memory and individual memories. And now what we're going to do is move toward Aristotle, because what we're really after is habituation. And so what you saw in that are, in the chopped episode, or snippet, you saw 4 folks who have been in the culinary world, have been chefs, and have acquired a practice. Right? So for Aristotle, though, practice was primarily a means to a way of life. And so you have key concepts in Aristotle: habit, virtue or excellence, state of being, and related to those are the concept of nature and telos. And so habit for Aristotle is those things that we do. And it's not the case that it's our habits that make us. That's actually the state of being. And so what we have, habituation and habit in Aristotle are not quite the same concept in the way that we use them in English, because we have habit and habituation, and those two things are more interrelated linguistically for us than they are for Aristotle. Hexis is the state of being for Aristotle, which is the steady state of one's character. So the virtue or excellence is what we strive for. So the nature is to understand a thing's existence, right? So his biological anthropology said human beings are created, or rather exist, like any other animal. And so we can begin to differentiate between animals and things that exist sort of in and of themselves, things that are not made by human beings. So we can differentiate between tools, say hammers and screwdrivers, and his great example is the thing that you sit on when you're riding a horse, a saddle, thank you. So a saddle, and these are things that craftspeople manufacture, they make. Now there is an art, there is a better saddle or a worse saddle, but the saddle isn't an end in itself. No one makes a saddle for its own sake. They make a saddle to go on a horse. And the saddle goes on the horse so that a person can ride the horse, and the person can ride the horse potentially in battle or away from something, or corral cattle, as we would use it in later times. But it's this idea that we can begin to see what a thing's nature is by the way it's used. And those natures are given, right? So we, in the modern world, tend to think of nature as this very malleable, constructed thing that it's only our social locations that give things or people their nature. For the ancients and for Aristotle in particular, in talking about habit and virtue, it was a given. So a horse had certain things that a horse did. And if the horse did it well, it was a good horse. If the horse did those things badly, say when you told it to go forward into battle, it retreated, that was a bad horse. So the most famous example in discussing nature was that I can take this rock, where Aristotle said I can take a rock, and I can throw the rock up in the air 10 times, 1,000 times, 10,000 times, and every time it comes down, it's still going to be a rock. No matter how many times I do a habit or a thing, I can't change its nature. So the rock is always going to come down. Similarly, fire is always going to go up. So no matter how you try to funnel the fire, the flame is going to want to come up. So we can't change a thing by its nature. Well, so then what is habit and habituation, or state of being, had to do. Well, so we need to understand how Aristotle understood what a human person was in contradistinction to an animal. Right? So by nature, right, we can be virtuous or we can be vicious, but we acquire those things. So for Aristotle, we are born not the tabula rasa that the modern mind thinks of, but we are born with certain dispositions and a certain ability to acquire virtue or vice. So if we think of it this way, where we're born and we have the capacity to either acquire and be shaped into habits that promote virtue, or the converse, we have the potential, we have the natural ability to be habituated into a way of life that is vicious. So we sit at birth in this place where we can go one of both directions, or one of either direction, sometimes both. Right? It's not the case that we are necessarily possessing the virtues all at once or all at a time. It is quite possible that in particular situations, I am more prone to cowardice but I am still generous, and I still give liberally, which would be the mean between prodigality or wastefulness and meanness on the other side, or being sort of a Scrooge, to put it into US or English common parlance. So the idea here is that we have this middle ground, and it's the middle ground that is the virtue. And so if we take a child and we put them into an education context and we grow them and we put them into a place where they can choose and are formed in such a way as to have virtue put before them, then their character has begun to be shaped, and eventually they come to operate in that middle ground. So the example on the board, we have cowardice on one extreme, and that's vice, right? And we have rashness on the other extreme, and that's vice. This would be the vice of excess. Cowardice would be the vice of insufficiency, and courage, the middle, or the mean, is the virtue. Now, it's important to know that later, the mean understanding of the virtues and vices is it's not a view that virtue ethics is committed to. There are many virtue ethicists that would disagree with Aristotle, but this is the basic model that holds all the way up through St. Thomas, which we'll see in a little bit. So how do we know then about the telos? Well, we know that for Aristotle, the idea is, how do you know what the chief end of a human person is? Or how do you know what the end of anything is? Right? And it's always a question of what can it be further, or where does it stop, essentially, is the way to think of it. So the example from the horse and the craft of making the saddles to go on the horse, for the rider to ride the horse, you may ride a horse as an end itself as a pleasurable activity, but that's not the highest form, because the highest form of social interaction is the polis, is the community. So it's actually the rider who rides the horse in service of probably the army in order to defend or enlarge the city. So once we've got to that point, then that's not the highest end. The highest end is in the military strategy so the end of, in a certain sense, the end of making a saddle is military strategy, to defend the polis, to protect the city, state, or to enlarge territory. That said, humans have their own peculiar telos, right? We saw that horses have telos. We saw, we can take a tool, a hammer. What is a hammer typically used for?
Nailing something.
To nail something. And so the good use of a hammer, the telos of a hammer, is to drive a nail into something. And then if we back up and say, what if I use that hammer for a weapon to drive someone's skull and crack their skull? Is that a good use of the hammer, or is that a bad use of the hammer? That would be a bad use of the hammer. And so then we have the question, then it's possible for the same thing to have good and to be used well, or to be used poorly. So when thinking about the human telos for Aristotle, he says, what is the human end? And he goes through these ideas and he settles on, what is it that humans do? Well, we do X. Well, why do you do X? Because it derives pleasure. Well, okay. So after this series of thoughts, he settles on the idea that we desire happiness. That our ultimate desire is happiness. We can't really desire happiness for some other end, right? Happiness is sort of an end in itself. And so the human being desires happiness, and this is the human person's telos. And to be fair, it is not the human person, it is the Athenian male who is a freeborn citizen. Right? It's a very specific and small class of persons who constitute a human person as he understands it. And it's what separates us from the animals is our ability to be rational and our ability to think and control our passions and our appetites and our desires. And so a person is born with different dispositions. So one of you maybe, let's take the example of courage since it's on the board. One of you may be particularly rash. And you are quick to get your hackles up and ready to fight at the slightest at the least sort of aggressive maneuver by someone else. Or the slightest offense, you're ready to fight. And someone else in the room is totally unwilling to fight and would rather run away and find another room to hide in. And both of these persons are vicious, right? One suffers from rashness, the other from cowardice. And it's up to the individual person to know where his or her sort of baseline disposition is toward. And so it can be corrected. The goal is always for every person to find their way back to that middle, find their way back to courage, or whatever the virtue is that's under consideration. If I tend toward wastefulness or prodigality instead of liberality, then I need to restrain my spending. And I may need to restrain it past the mean of liberality in order to circumvent and correct my nature over time. And so the goal then is to get that state of being so that when I come into a new situation, I can always know which action to take. Right? It's the virtue is not a rule. It is not a thing that is always to be done across the board. It is rather a state of being or a character that the person possessing the character knows what action to take at which particular time, at which particular place. So a person that, right, the quintessential example to contrast virtue ethics with a rule or principle-based ethic is the Nazis are knocking on your door and you're harboring Jews upstairs, and the categorical imperative is to always tell the truth. And do you tell the Nazi soldier at your door that you are harboring Jews upstairs, or do you lie? The virtue ethicist answers that differently. Rather than there's a rule to not lie, they can begin to think about what is the situation, what is the virtuous thing to do in this particular situation? Because I don't have a fixed set of rules. I do have standards. I do have virtues or excellences that suggest how I ought to respond. And the more stable I am in my character over time, the better able I am to answer that question when the need arises. Are there questions at this point on sort of Aristotle's understanding? No? It's clear as mud? Yeah.
How value laden is his differentiation of, I don't know, sentient beings, animals, people, tools? Is there, how sort of strict a hierarchy is there?
It's extremely strict.
Okay.
So it's strict in the sense that you're either an animal or you're a human. But then once you get into humans, you have a hierarchy of human personhood, right? So you have the Athenian free male, and then virtually everybody else falls underneath that in some way or another. And the degree to which that's important. So we'll see a little bit later because we'll talk slightly about education, because it's really, right, so for him this is moral education, and this is how you acquire those things. And so the idea that certain people were not to be educated and that certain things were allowed for the masses that were not allowed for Athenian free males, and certainly not their children while they're in this formative stage, is critically important in his moral education. But it's not the case that you'd see a large differentiation like we might make today, right? So to take the position that some vegans might take, or some vegetarians might take, like, oh, I want to eat fish, I'll eat fish, but certain kinds of fish because they're lower sentient beings than are dolphins. So I won't eat a dolphin, but I'll eat a mollusk, right? So that sort of taxonomy doesn't exist for him that I'm aware of. For him, it was more, it was animals, and where you began to differentiate them is like what their telos was. Really, like, what are they useful for, and how can we use them, right? So they didn't possess the rational soul, which is really what separates us from, or what separated Athenian men from animals. And so it is a strict hierarchy within the human personhood. It is more of a bifurcation. Like, these are completely different, though we share a lot of similarities. But once you get that rational soul, it's a different set of questions. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Right? Whereas, so a later Aristotelian, like the Nussbaum, would draw on those same sorts of principles to make claims that we actually have to protect animals in ways that, I don't think would make sense to Aristotle.
Using an example of the saddle, this has to do primarily with background, virtual or essence. What if the maker who makes a saddle is not in the saddle for his art object versus functional? Does that become a virtue or an excellence or a worthless?
Yeah, it's a tough question. Like, that wasn't the case, right?
Right.
So, I mean, right, so in certain senses that requires a certain amount of superfluousness, right? That you would create an object that's useful to make it not useful, right? If I have three things, I may not need all three of them to be used. But if I only have one thing, then I need it to be useful. So that may be a question that is not as important to him, or is just beyond his ability to really think about. Because, I mean, they did have art.
Right.
Right? But exactly, right? You were not making art that was things that were useful you weren't making tools, right? And so, to what extent does art have an end in itself? Pleasure. I mean, that's a whole question about his aesthetics that I'm unprepared to answer. So I don't think that would even enter. Right. Right, it wasn't a possibility. Like, why would, I mean, essentially, like, why would you do that? Like, that seems ridiculous. I think, I might be wrong, but I think in terms of useful objects,
Well,
as
yeah,
art,
even the useful objects at this time, they didn't go so extreme that they may not be useful. I mean, vases, vases,
right,
bowls, they could decorate to an extreme, but they still.
right. Because that was, partially because that is to tell us of the thing, right? You don't make something that's not.
You don't go to, yeah, unlike today, you don't go to the extreme of making something that is no longer the thing that you made it, just so you can set up your show.
Right. There's not a knick-knack culture.
Right.
Right? I mean, they acquired things, obviously, and they had art, and they had cultural studies, and they had music, and they had these things that existed, but they weren't, but they existed differently. And even music existed for a purpose, as we'll see. So maybe that's actually a good segue, unless there are other quick questions. Yeah.
So how would Aristotle say that, let's say somebody who thought that they were being in the courage realm, they were cowardice, they were rash, and they thought that they were in the same amount of courage. How would you check that? Or how would Aristotle say you check that?
That's actually the role of character friendship. And so you see at the end of Nicomachean Ethics that you have these roles of two-part answer. The first part is character friendship. You have three friendships in Aristotle. You have utility, and you have, the middle one is escaping me off the top of my head, and then you have character friendship. And the character friendship is the highest form of friendship. And it's in that you would, sort of to borrow a Pauline phrase to explain it, as iron sharpens iron, so does one person sharpen another. It's this idea of character friendship. I like this person because of their character, and they like me because of my character, and we are invested in one another's character. And so I'm going to say to that person, I know you think you acted courageously in this, but I think you actually acted a little bit rash. Right? And this is a gradient, right? It's not either you're rash or you're coward or you're courageous. That every kind of move toward this, it's at the extreme that you have rash. So though the mean is courageous, you can be a little too rash. Right? You can be a little too cowardice. So I think the first part of the answer is that you have friendships that would invoke questions and ponder. The second part of that answer is you can disagree. It is one of the difficulties, I think, of virtue ethics is that you can disagree. And so at the end of the day, I might disagree with a character friend. I might, or someone else evaluating it might disagree with both of our assessments. The difference is that there's a common language and a common way to think about the virtue, right? And it's against that backdrop that we'll see a little bit later that we don't have, right? We tend to think about the power dynamic. We tend to think about what is going to the extreme of total subjectivity, or radical relativism, that there is no standard. Like to even raise the question of cowardice or rashness or courage is like courageous to who, right? Like that's a great question, right? So there has to be, and Aristotle can assume a shared way of life already, right? So he's writing out of a culture that has inherited the Homer heroic tradition, which is especially evident as he thinks about courage, because the highest form of courage is facing death in battle. And so it's kind of this heroic, Homeric warrior that is the ideal of courage for him. But it becomes increasingly difficult when the retort is, well, whose courage, to quote a later Aristotelian, whose justice, which rationality, or whose courage, which rationality. And that's largely the point that later Aristotelians are trying to make against sort of the late modern dilemma how do we know that was courageous?
Right.
So it is an open question. There are means to answering it within Aristotle's day. And it's definitely not a closed system. We see Aristotle disagreeing both on some of Plato's laws and also taking a very different tact to how we know the good. Right? Aristotle goes from the many to the one and arguing directly against Plato and arguing against Socrates in some places where Plato has recorded Socrates' writing and thought. So it's an open and ongoing tradition in argument. The difference is that it's taking place within a coherent and shared assumptions and largely shared values. So I can say you're being a coward and you know what I mean. Or a character friend can say, no, that was right, and you know what I mean. Like, that was courageous. So it's a shared semantic domain and shared cultural values. So since we're talking about education, and this is largely education, as Plato and Aristotle share many of the same concerns as regards the purpose of education and its methods, the high degree of agreement between them can be attributed to two factors. First, the ancient Greeks generally revered their own tradition. Right? There's when I was in Iowa, I learned a saying that the Dutch have, and it's at least the English-speaking Dutch of the U.S. If you ain't Dutch, you ain't much. Greeks kind of thought the same thing. Greeks and barbarians, and the barbarians was the rest of the world. So they weren't real keen on giving up their tradition, though they would refine it and argue amongst themselves. In contrast, right, those of us in the late modern Western world, we hear the word tradition and we start to shudder and say, why would I want that? And then secondly, Plato too, or Aristotle. So we see that tradition does not imply passive acceptance. As I mentioned, we have the two examples of education and metaphysics. And so Plato really discusses his education philosophy in the Republic, books 4 and 10, and Laws 2 and 7. And so remember in Republic, or for those of you who can't recall the Republic, I shall say, there's a general classification of lower class that includes merchants, farmers, artisans, and the like. And then there's a guardian class that exists to protect the city. They are the ones that sort of guide the city, protect it both in terms of intellectual and its moral well-being. And then the best of the guardians become the philosopher kings. And these higher classes are the ones that we must pay attention to when we're talking about moral education, because it's only the two higher classes that receive proper education, and that is sort of the cultural studies. So education for them is also fundamentally moral education. So there's no possibility of doing education that is not moral education. To be educated is to be moral, to be virtuous, and to have one's character formed. Is that a question or just a
the question is, when you then the definition of education, it's less informatory and more transformatory in that sense?
They don't think in those categories.
Oh, okay.
Right? So those are very modern categories. Right? So, I mean, if you think about the nature, right? And I think we'll see this a little bit in just a couple of paragraphs. If you think about the nature that is malleable and open to either virtue or vice, then I can't change the person's nature, right? They're always going to be malleable or open to virtue or vice, right? So if that's the case, then the idea is that we are, and the goal, right, is to nurture children to virtue and steer them away from the vices, then all I'm doing is adding to their nature what they already are capable of, right? I'm only putting those things in front of them which they are already capable of, that they may acquire the right kind of education, right? So you can be educated badly, but it's just that, it's bad education, right? So it's never neutral, where that's kind of where the modern mind would go, that we have this information thing, right? Like I can know that 2 + 2 is 4, and that we can kind of call that information. But then we want to have this other thing that we call transformative learning, which is like somehow changing, right? Mesereau, Paulo Freire, this kind of really changing thought orientation. And so I think the question just isn't the question that they would ask, right? Their question is, and they weren't distinct, right? So we'll see that there's a very regimented, and it's only after you accomplish whatever it is at age 12 or 13 that you move on, right? And if you're capable of doing what needs to be done at 13, then you move on. And if you're capable of doing what needs to be done at 21, then you move on, right? So it's not even until you're my age that you even begin to be thinking about sort of the broader philosophical questions, right? Education continues until you're 35. And so it's only then that I would be getting to read Plato and listening to Aristotle's lectures, right? Until then, I'm doing, but it was the idea that all of these things are integrated and build on one another, right? And so if it's a received truth, right? So mathematics, until you start doing really conceptual mathematics, it's really about a given, right? 2 + 2 is always 4. 2 + 3 is always 5. And so that's a given in a way that they also thought that the rest of the world was given. And so there's a greater continuity, and so it's really about getting right education. And there's nothing really to transform, because you're simply acquiring the right education. Does that make sense? Yeah. I mean, it's really, I think, so counterintuitive for us. Like, we have a really hard time thinking of it that way. So to begin book 2, Plato accepts that no greater division of education could be devised than that which has existed for a long period of time. So he's accepting the inheritance. Education had been divided into 2 parts, exercise for the body and cultural studies for the mind. For Plato, the most important part of any enterprise is the beginning, especially when something young and sensitive is involved. You see, that's when most of its formation takes place, and it absorbs every impression that anyone wants to stamp upon it. So we should be especially attentive to the cultural studies of children if we want to understand where Plato thinks education ought to start and the direction it ought to go. So one of the first things that children encounter are stories. And so stories occupy one of the principal teaching devices of cultural studies. This might sound familiar to some of us hanging out in narrative theology and stories. Literature may be true or false. So stories may be false if they do not treat, or stories may be false if they mistreat the divine nature. So Plato asserts that God is unchanging and only capable of good. So stories that suggest that God can change or causes evil, they must be censored. Right? So if the goal is right education, why would I tell someone something that wasn't true? I'm only going to tell them what's true. I'm only going to put stories about the gods that cohere with what we know about the gods. So we must have stories. And so further, stories must cohere with the virtues. So I can't have heroic characters, I can't have the hero of the story succumb to all sorts of wanton behaviors, right? That would be subverting moral excellence, and that would be a false story. So those two must be censored. And we must not have stories in which men and good women, to update it, exhibit emotion, but non-exemplary women can be shown with emotional expressions. Right? So restraining the emotions is of significance. Laughter too must be expelled, for it leads to emotional outburst. And moreover, stories must highly praise the virtue of honesty. And only leaders can lie for the good of the city, a foreshadowing of the noble lie. Right, so as you advance on in the Republic, there's a lie that has to be told that the philosopher kings have, or the children that would become philosopher kings have a different set of metallic in their brain, and so they are therefore superior. And that's the noble lie that society has to hinge upon. And courage in battle and self-discipline. The children who would become guardians and most especially require the latter two virtues. Warriors must be courageous and self-disciplined in order to protect their community. So passages and stories should thus promote fear of Hades, obedience to authority, and moderation in food, drink, and sex. The content of stories should always point children toward the good. Stories, however, contain both content and style. So Plato next considers appropriate styles for children. Pure style functions similar to first-person or omniscient narration, whereas representational style, the author takes on the character of different persons. The latter style leans toward dishonesty and so must be guarded against, right? Because if I'm taking on a character as I tell the story, I'm being dishonest because I'm not that character. So as an omniscient narrator, I can tell the truth. But if I'm deceiving, I have to guard against that sort of